noise, and safety are required. In the San Joaquin Valley, air quality is also required. And as of last year, we passed SB 1000, which is an environmental justice requirement for any city or county that has an identified disadvantaged area. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means later in the slide deck. And part of the environmental justice requirement is to address air quality. So that has expanded dramatically, the regions that are required to address air quality and EJ. But in our outreach and in our discussions with stakeholders, we did quite a bit of that over the past 5 years. We heard that there were new things happening around cities and counties, new priorities, and also more interest in certain areas. So we included some new chapters on things that folks wanted more guidance on. That includes social equity and resilience, economic development, climate change, healthy communities, and public engagement. So our vision was to update the guidelines. So again, can you guys raise your hands who has seen the 2003 one? Yeah, so it's a black and white PDF that lives in one large document on the internet, right? So we wanted to update it a little bit, sort of bring it more into a user-friendly place and make it more accessible to a larger community. And not just have it be a document, but more of a suite of tools. So this is actually a screenshot of our new website, which was a long time in preparation as well. Each section of the general plan is listed separately in terms of themes and subject areas. We have some new tools and resources up there. They're broken down into requirements and non-required elements, and everything is linked both within and without the document. So when you're in the document, you can look through, say, the circulation section, and when it starts talking about land use or healthy communities, you can click on it and it'll take you straight there. If it starts talking about an outside resource, you can click on it, it'll take you straight to that resource. So in that way, we've tried to sort of incorporate a lot more into it, but also make it more user-friendly so people can just sit down and do it. Now, anyone who wants to can still print the entire PDF as one document. That is still an option that is available, but then you lose some of those links.
And just as a quick note on the website, if you're still having trouble accessing the website, we've had quite a few comments of people unable to access it. It basically tells you there's a security warning. The primary reason for that is we went from a secure site to a non-secure site. We don't manage people's personal information, credit cards, or anything like that, so we were paying extra money to have a secure site. And so we thought, for the positive benefit of our taxpayers' return on investment, we would go to a non-secure site, but it has caused some issues with your virus and protection software on your computers. The way to solve it is to go into your cache, clear your cache, and that will take care of it. There's a utility section that you can go into. If you do have problems clearing your cache, feel free to email us, and we'll give you the step-by-step on how to do it. It's been a real struggle. We apologize for that. We know it's prevented some folks from accessing the data and information on here.
We are not trying to hack into your personal data.
Yeah, we're not trying to stop your personal data, trust us. So there's a number of tools and resources that have been developed in parallel with the general plan guidelines. If you go to the next slide, one of them is the general plan guidelines data mapping tool. What we heard a lot from people was that they wanted access to data that was pretty much the standard data that goes into any general plan update. Parcel data, data on habitat, data on highways, and making sure that that data is consistent across jurisdictional boundaries. Anybody that has worked as a counter planner like me and have had to try to match up parcel boundaries between counties, you know how frustrating it can be to actually have a consistent set of parcel data or any other data that's independently managed by counties or consultants. So we've put up quite a bit of data that's considered authoritative state data. It meets our metadata standards, it meets quality standards, and we're going to be updating that data over time through a web services arrangement. So if you want to build your own widget, you want to build your own general plan tool for a general plan update, this data you can import into your tool, you can download it to a local server and manipulate it, or you can use it as a web service, meaning it can just function independently and we will update it for you as time goes on so you don't have to worry about it going stale. We're going to continue building on this tool, building usability into it. We have a number of other data layers that were queued up, but the quality just wasn't quite there yet. We're going to have some additional resources like a a video user guide that's going to be going up in the next month or two. So there's a lot of different improvements that are happening right now. Please do go on to this site. If you have questions about it, my contact information is there, as well as our web developer. And if you have questions, concerns, or suggestions, please let us know, particularly if there's data sets that are valuable to you. You know, the Sierra is a pretty unique area, and for folks that are on the phone from outside of the Sierra, you know, all of our regions are unique areas that have their own unique data needs. We're typically focused on statewide data sets, but we also can drill down into some more detail if we have that authoritative data within the state.
So I'm just going to run through some of the big changes that we've made in this version, in addition to the sort of updates that I already mentioned. Throughout the entire document, and I will also say that all of these changes are based primarily on stakeholder input. We did a lot of community meetings, a lot of meetings with agencies and stakeholder groups, as well as a lot of these types of workshops during our draft process. And we took everything we heard, whether it was in a workshop or written and sent to us, and tried to incorporate it and address it as best we could. So based on all of that, we were asked, one of the first things we were asked to do was really separate out what is required from what is additional guidance. So that is a big concern for a lot of communities. They want to make sure they're addressing all the requirements, especially as there's so many new ones in the last 14, 15 years. So we worked with our lawyers to create a completeness checklist for every statutory requirement in a general plan. So at the beginning of each required element chapter, you'll see a checklist of exactly what you have to address in every general plan for that element. Additionally, we created correlation charts for each element, which you'll see later in the slide deck, so that people can see right up front what elements are related to each other by statute. So for example, land use and circulation must be coordinated, and what elements are related to each other just logically. So where they're closely connected, but maybe don't have to be coordinated. We've inserted recommended data tables for each element. Again, I'll show you an example of that later in the deck. And we pulled policy language from communities all across the state, trying really hard to make sure they're as varied as possible, and put them in template format. So we put them in a format that could easily be copied, manipulated, and pasted into general plans by subject area, and then directly linked to the general plan which they come from where available, so that communities can say, this is something I care about, maybe I could just pull that and modify it to fit my needs as well. There's live links both internally and externally to tools, resources, and additional information, as well as different sections of the text, as I mentioned additionally. And so that's throughout the entire document. Thank you. So I'm going to go through each of the chapters, and I'll try and do this fairly quickly. Some of them will take a little longer than others. We start out with an introduction, something that one of our goals in doing this update as well is to make more access communities outside of just planners. So we want the basic community members to be a little more involved and understand the planning process. We wanted NGOs and community partners and other agencies like public health, a group that we talked to a lot, for example, to just be a little more aware of the process, involved as they could be, and be able to coordinate a little better. So part of that was just opening up what a general plan is, how it's important, what it can and can't do, and making that a lot more clear for folks. So we started with an introduction. We talk about all the changes that we've made in this general plan, a coordination of this plan, of this guidelines and other state work, including CalAdapt, our scoping plan, hazard mitigation plans, and others, and then discuss the difference between how we explain statutory language and additional guidance.
Yeah, and just to point on some of these items that are listed here, the coordination with state work, this is primarily climate change focused. There's a lot of other things that are up, but since Sierra Camp helped us host this, we thought we'd highlight a couple of the climate pieces. And thank you again, Sierra Camp, for helping us organize this.
I started with that, actually. Yeah, thank you. So we've also added a new chapter on visioning for communities, really recognizing that the idea of starting with the outcomes that a community wants and what their value system is really essential to long-term planning. So in this chapter, we talk about how to start with a vision. We also talk about the relationship between local plans and local priorities and our overall state goals and how we work together to get to those both complementary items. And then just the basics of general plans. This is where we have the glossary of terms and sort of what is a general plan and why does it matter.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we heard from our workshops prior to publishing the draft was the community members really need to understand what a general plan can and cannot do. It also has, it's not the fix-all. It doesn't fix all the problems in a community, and there needs to be an understanding that, if you want to engage, that's great, but there are things that the general plan cannot do in a community. So we outline that in a little bit here, but also in the next chapter.
So the third chapter is the community engagement and outreach chapter. Again, we didn't just want it to be about public notices at the statutory minimum, which I think most people here know is just 2 notices for the planning purposes. I think there's a recognition and understanding across communities across the state that that's just not enough to get people to really be invested and buy in and want to do the implementation of the plan throughout the whole process. So we pulled up all of the community engagement work and pulled it right into the front of the document before we even start talking about the elements, recognizing that this is really where it has to all begin. And we pulled different designs of processes from different communities, some examples that we've seen of innovative ways that things are working based on cultural needs and community needs and the different values of different communities. The main sort of broad strokes of this are to design the process from the beginning, to really think about what the engagement is going to look like throughout the entire process, knowing that, especially if you're doing a comprehensive update of the general plan, it can take a very, very long time. So it's great to have people join in the beginning, but how do you keep them engaged? Other ideas about things like advisory boards or committees to engage different types of partners throughout the community. Considerations around culture, around equity, around language, around childcare, around income, just things that we want people to give a little more thought to, and we've heard are useful in this realm. And then, of course, a lot of links to data, resources, and tools that are available to do some of this work in places we've seen.
Next slide. One of the things that we've heard quite a bit, and it's reflected in SB 1000, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, but the ability to not just be engaged, but to influence a process is something of great interest to many community groups. And there's an acknowledgement that sometimes our planning processes don't incorporate the influence of those underrepresented communities. So, Sahar, I'll leave it to you to.
Yeah, so one of the things that this is a community engagement spectrum that's included in the document. It's a form of thinking about how to do community engagement. And traditional planning really does, I would even argue that it stops here. A lot of it can move into consult and sometimes involve, but we really want to get people to move as far down this spectrum as possible. So the whole community feels like they're a part of the process, they feel engaged, they feel like they have buy-in, and they have influence on what's happening in their community. So we've tried to give tools and examples of how that has worked in other places. So I'm going to jump into the required elements. Usually we stop here for questions, so we're not going to do that.
Well, maybe we can take 1 or 2 questions from this audience if there are some, and then folks online, really apologize, but we'll have to hold questions for you guys until the end. Anybody have any burning questions in here?
Yeah.
The public process.
Yeah.
OPR stepping into public process realm, I think is worth noting. I appreciate the empower, but that assumes the stakeholders understand and are burdened with having to deliver a general plan that meets all the state requirements. Yeah. So do you have any strategies in your piece to ensure that happens?
Yeah, I think that.
So the question was, I don't know if everybody online heard that, but the question was, are there strategies in the general plan guidelines that help engage and support community members through an empowerment process by making sure that they're also aware of what's in the statute, what's required in the guidelines itself?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things at different points that we hit on to help with that. And again, we're just trying to move the needle here, but I think one of the things is really trying to break down and make as easily accessible as possible a format of the guidelines themselves, rather than just having people have to refer to statute and planning speak, which is, I think, what most of us here are used to. But also things like advisory boards, things like community groups that are representative of different parts of the community and can stay engaged throughout the whole process and can do a deeper dive into the different parts of the plan rather than just, and also report back. One of the things we've heard from communities that's working really well is engaging community members in part of the process and then reporting back on how that engagement has affected their process. Because as Michael mentioned, what we hear is people give their input and then never hear back and don't feel like they've been heard. So really making people feel like they're heard in the process.
Just as you said when I was first saying hello to you, and you said, well, hopefully some of my comments from last time actually got incorporated, and they did. Thank you.
Yes.
Just to continue on that, you get into, a lot of people don't, making this information available, but people don't read anymore. So like gamification, animation, video, do you talk about that, or is that kind of outside of the scope of?
We talk about sort of innovative new techniques that are coming up. I don't know that we specifically talked about gamification or animation, but we have talked about different types of social media, different types of video, different types of networking that might be able to reach different communities. And one of the things I'll mention later in this is a little more about how we plan on updating these. So as new things come up and as we get more case studies on things that are working, we definitely want to include them because this is a rapidly changing field as well.
The virtual reality general plan.
Yeah.
Well, and I think
Heather has one of those virtual reality things.
And to that point, Marin County developed a game of floods to help inform some of their work, and we're seeing that as a potential model for replicating that gamification process as a part of the public outreach process. And it worked really well in Marin. Maybe it wouldn't work in other communities, but we're looking for examples like that. So if you guys have done interesting things or of things that have worked that are outside of the box, we really want to know about it. We'll write up the case studies and we'll put it on our website.
We have a lot of experience with Game of Fire.
Yes.
I mean, interesting.
Well, there is a discussion right now about doing a Game of Flood style kind of game for fire.
Great.
Yeah. I want to come back and just make a comment.
Yeah.
So, my sense is even though we're trying to make the new guidelines more accessible, the changing stuff, general plans are becoming more complex.
Yep.
I think it's really hard to argue that that's
Yeah, absolutely.
which works against really trying to get greater public involvement. And I think that there's just a tension there that planning practitioners need to be thinking about, and hopefully you all are in these strategies. So.
Yeah, I think the acknowledgement is so the comment was about how complicated general plans have become, and part of it is building really robust campaigns to help support that public process, because by statute, two workshops where someone stands in front of a group of people and tells them what's happening, that's not going to work anymore. And you do have to get a lot more creative about how you do that community engagement process. And all the way from, I've been a lot of great workshops over the past 7 years as we've been going through this to get a better idea of what works and what doesn't. And I personally really love the model where it's almost a community convening, where there's multiple stations all around a very large room where people can talk about individual subjects and really dig down into the details, because ultimately that's what people care about from the community that are showing up. Most of the time in general plan workshops that are that traditional model, it's one person standing in front of a group of people outlining very general topics about how they're going to proceed. But people really want to drill down to the details of how their community is going to be affected. So we've seen workshops that have been organized that drill down into neighborhood scale issues, into topical issues, and maybe there's a series of those over that time period. And it's not nearly as simple as the campaigns have been in the past, and unfortunately that also means higher costs. But to really do that engagement that is meaningful and get the participation from the public, ultimately that seems to be the route that folks are starting to take.
I think that's great going into having these deep dives, but there's been a lot of these processes that meeting people to death. The average cost of a public meeting, public and private and everything, is between $45,000 and $56,000 if you add up all the true costs. So just using all of the tools in the toolkit and streamlining the engagement process at the same time with the feedback loops is critical, or you're going to lose people.
Yeah, I think it's what's complicated, and what makes this difficult is, I think, to your point, this is a very complicated process, and it's a long-term process, and there's a lot of statutory requirements, but it's also a way of getting towards longer-term goals that communities are invested in. So it's two parts. It's one is getting people to understand what the process can and can't do and how they can. But the other part is also reaching non-traditional community members for this process, and that is something we've seen as more and more important. I think it's sort of broken down into both of those because, you know, I've been involved in my local planning for a long time. It's the same people always showing up to the same meetings. And so how do we reach the people that care about these things? Because everyone in the community cares about some aspect of this, and actually make it accessible to them so they understand how they can affect it, but also make it in a way that they can actually be a part of the process, not inhibited by either work or family or language or what have you, right? That's sort of how we've tried to break it down.
And again, case studies, if you're aware of things that work, we really want to hear about them, and we want to put them up on our website so others can actually learn from the work that you guys have done.
Yeah.
Do you want to jump into the mandatory?
Sure. So the mandatory elements are broken down based on statute, just in the order that they're listed. No one is more important than the other. That's actually specified by law, and court cases have upheld that. So we start with the land use element. Again, this is something that we heard a lot of feedback on, a lot of requests on more guidance and more information, and sort of some problems that have arisen or some issues that have arisen throughout general plans around the state and how to better address them. So we've done a more thorough explanation of a lot of the relationships between land use and other elements, including expanded information on form-based codes. That's something that we've had a lot of people be interested in as a means to reach the values and objectives that they want for their plans. We've included more detailed examples of different types of land use maps and diagrams because there's been a little bit of confusion about what has to be in a land use diagram, as well as some innovative ways that people are really using mapping to sort of expand on their general plans.
And the statute actually says diagram.
Yeah.
So what does that actually mean? We had a debate about this internally when we were going through this because nobody really uses diagrams anymore. It's more.
But it doesn't have to be.
GIS, and you know, this is what when in the age before Mylar overlays. I guess. Who remembers Mylar overlays?
Yeah.
PH there, so.
Well, that's how anyway. So we have an expanded section on military compatibility and land use that relates directly to our military land use compatibility handbook that OPR has recently updated.
We're looking at that. Department of Defense has been a great partner over the past few years in making sure that we're talking with each other. Obviously in the Sierra, there's a lot of training routes, and that's one of the areas of focus in the handbook. So definitely encourage you to take a look at that as a resource. This is one of those things where we didn't spend a lot of time with it inside the general plan guidelines. We work that went into developing that resource.
Yeah, and you'll see throughout the full document, in places like that where there's a lot of additional resources available, we sort of explain what situations and how you might be able to use those resources, and then link to them as sort of the core of the resource itself. Two examples of areas where we've provided additional information based on feedback we heard. One is school siting, recognizing that there's sometimes a disconnect between school districts and land use planners in trying to ensure that all of the different objectives are being met by both parties, and how to engage each other a little more proactively, as well as examples of how that might be beneficial to both. As well, and we also included a new section on waste management. California has pretty lofty goals of reducing our landfill debris, and there's a lot that needs to be done for that. So we've included some examples of places that are working on some policies and some activities around waste management, and then also some land use considerations that you may have to think about if you're going to address some waste management goals. And again, there's live links and examples throughout this section, as there are in others. Thank you. So the next section is the circulation element. As I mentioned earlier, we have just submitted our updated guidance on CEQA guidelines to the Resources Agency, and that includes probably the biggest change in CEQA for quite some time, which is the change from level of service to vehicle miles traveled. Now that is a CEQA change, it is not a planning change. However, we have quite a few communities that have asked for guidance on how to incorporate it into their planning. And we have a few examples of places that have already started doing it. We don't have those examples in yet because we don't have enough information on how it's affecting them, but that will be part of the first update that we have. So there's guidance on how sort of different tiered methods that you could incorporate the new VMT metric into your planning purposes, either alongside LOS or in place of LOS, depending on what your needs and your goals are. So there's some more information in the guidelines on that. We've also pulled the safety appendix from the CEQA guidelines themselves on analyzing transportation impacts for planning purposes. Around safety, and that is included in the general plan guidelines. So it's a standalone document, but it's also an appendix in the guidelines.
And also acknowledging, for example, SBC has graciously completed quite a few greenhouse gas inventories. So there's generally an understanding, as has TRPA, but generally a good understanding of what vehicle miles travel and the linkage to greenhouse gas emissions is there. And that is certainly one of the primary focuses of this. And I think one of the things that folks are going to have to go back to do that have done that VMT analysis in the past for emissions is knowing that these new requirements under CEQA would likely change that approach somewhat. And so a refreshment of methodology would be needed in the future. We're still working on how to help with implementing that. I think it's going to be one of the discussions for 2018 on how we engage and support communities that are going from the VMT analysis in their climate action plans and greenhouse gas inventories to also using that to help support this analysis.
Yeah. So one of the other things we heard in the circulation element was that people wanted a lot more information and a lot more guidance on how to incorporate their SB 375 and the coordination of land use and circulation. So we've extended the discussion on that, the relationship between land use and circulation and sort of the benefits of aligning them. There's no new statutory requirement around that, so it's more just guidance on how to coordinate them. And then again, there's new sections and increased discussion around emerging issues around parking, around active transportation, complete streets, and a new section on considerations of different trade-offs that have to be made when you're thinking about transportation decisions specifically. Circulation is not just transportation, it's also broadband, it's also utilities. So there's a lot of discussion in here around innovative policies we're seeing in things like Dig Once policies and examples that we've pulled from different communities throughout the state. The housing element, I always like to tell people when we're doing these workshops that originally the housing element was by itself 100 pages. And so we had to cut that down substantially. Anyone who's worked on housing element knows that HCD, the Housing Community Design, see, I did it. Development. I use too many acronyms, apparently. The Housing Community Development Agency has very specific requirements around the housing element, and it is the only element that has a timeline attached to it. Depending on where you are, which schedule you're on, it's 4, 5, or 8 years. And so we worked with them to mostly have them write this section and then sort of align it with the rest of the general plan guidelines. But they had gone into so many specifics that it was just way too long and it was going to take up too much of the document. So they actually recently updated their website. It's a lot more user-friendly, I think. And so what we've done is sort of break down each statutory requirement with a short explanation and then a direct link to where it's talked about on their website so that they retain expertise on it. They have a lot of case studies and examples for each section, and we just link directly to it. In addition to that, we've added new discussions and new sections on the things that housing really impacts in California and throughout the country, housing and health, housing and climate, housing and economic development, and a brand new expanded discussion on displacement, because that is a big issue in California right now, displacement and affordable housing. So, and actually, if we stay on this slide for 1 second, this is a good an example. You can't really read it, but this is an example of our correlation chart that's in each chapter. It has the section, the element that we're looking at, and then how it's related to each of the other elements underneath it.
Yeah, and just a note on the housing package that passed this last year in the legislature for this last session. We acknowledge that there's going to need to be a pretty significant update to many different chapters of the general plan guidelines to respond to that. The plan in the short term is to update the housing element itself, knowing that a 2018/2019 update will be required for the entire housing package. So a little bit more of an extended timeline than we would typically work on. So it'll go beyond this administration into the next. So we'll be developing some transition memos to make sure that folks understand some of the implications of that housing package on the general plan guidelines.
Michael, just a comment on that. It's interesting that the housing wasn't identified in state planning.
In the state planning?
You showed the slide earlier.
The 2002 state planning priorities?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Reduce greenhouse gas, preserve open space and working landscapes, and have efficient development patterns.
Well, that's not on purpose. We'll have to go back and add that.
What about housing?
Well, but they are in statute.
They're in statute.
Yeah. I mean, I think that development infill is, but yes, we don't, it doesn't mention housing specifically in the statute. It's true. Conservation and open space, there's been a few minor changes in statute to these, but nothing major. And so what we've done is obviously talk about the minor changes, but also expand the links and discussion around examples, new innovative things that people are doing, such as green prints and daylighting of waterways, which is happening more and more throughout the state. And then one of the big changes, or actually I guess clarifications, is around the tribal resources and coordination requirement with open space and conservation, and so we've updated that section pretty significantly as well.
And when it comes to the tree mortality discussion, I know which is a hot topic in the Sierra for obvious reasons, we do reference resources, but resources are being developed and approaches and policies are being developed so quickly right now. We weren't really able to catch up to that within the general plan guidelines itself. So in the 2018 update that we're going to be doing, I think that's one of the things we can take a look at and see if there's additional narrative we can put in there about how to address mortality using some of these resources and policies and approaches that are coming online this year and last.
I think there's quite a few things that are happening right now in the state that are really exciting. There's policies and programs being put in that we would love to highlight, but we're not quite at a place where we can say, look what happened when they did this yet. So hopefully during our next update, we'll be able to add more of those examples.
There always comes a time, this was a 7-year process, right? So there always comes a time where you have to just say, okay, we're going to pause, wrap up the document, get it published, and then we'll have to address what all this new stuff that's coming online in the next version. So that's kind of what we had to do to be able to just stop and get it published.
And then, of course, like a week later, the housing package.
Right, exactly.
Okay, next slide, please. So the noise element, I think, has caused a little bit of confusion. And so let me just discuss what happened with the noise element. We have not had any statutory changes to the noise requirement. And we decided to maintain the noise element because we're not noise experts over at OPR, doing a deep dive into specifics such as decibel levels for communities would require a new gathering of a lot of experts around the table, which I think we hope to do in the coming years, but that is not something that we did in this update. Instead, what we did is we talked to communities and stakeholder groups around what they cared about around noise, because there are emerging issues around noise. Things like our goals towards urban infill and agricultural shifts have created new discussions and new issues around noise and its impacts on communities and on health, which is talked about a little more in the healthy community section. So we have a new discussion in the noise element around noise and infill, around noise trade-offs that are good for consideration for communities. We linked to a lot of external noise guidance and resources because, again, we are not the noise technical experts. And then we've maintained the original noise discussion in the document. I think in our next update, what we plan to do is merge those two discussions and make it a little more clear. But again, there haven't been any statutory changes, and the real specifics of things like decibel levels are not things we can mandate. So the charts and the ranges that we have in there haven't really changed at this point. I think that we would need a pretty thorough update and a pretty thorough outreach process to be able to really update those. But that is something we're thinking about.
Safety element, there were some pretty significant statutory changes to the safety element. It's some of the things that had some interim technical advisories over the past few years, like fire and flood, were integrated into the chapter itself. And climate change adaptation is now required to be addressed in all general plans, which is something from the legislature in 2015, SB 379. So there are some significant changes there. One of the things that we've been working with the Office of Emergency Services on is how to better align local hazard mitigation plans and safety elements so that there isn't this completely redundant process taking place on analyzing community risks. We're going to continue working with them on that, but we've provided some guidance and support on how to do that more effectively in this chapter. And the internal and external links, I think, were really helpful. There's just a lot of content available on how to address community risk, and there's a lot of different risks. All communities have different risk kind of environments that they're operating in, and this allows them to be able to select those risks that actually apply most directly to their jurisdiction. One of the things that we really try to do here is work with other parts of the state and external organizations so that we weren't being inconsistent. It's I think one of the biggest things that people are looking for is consistency. So we've aligned with OES resources, the caladapt.org tool, which looks at climate risk, the adaptation planning guide, which was developed by the Resources Agency and OES in partnership with the Office of Planning and Research. And then the new group called the Integrated Climate Adaptation Resiliency Program at OPR. We were formed, ICARP was formed in 2015 as a result of legislation, SB 246, that really gives OPR the authority to support the conversation around adaptation, similar to how their Resources Board has their board activities. We now have a technical advisory council that's a public-facing body that's informing decisions at the state level on how to both work with our local partners, but also how to engage with regional and federal interests too. Next slide. Climate change adaptation, obviously one of the big changes here. It really takes a look at what is the environmental setting of your general plan that you're planning towards. It really encourages communities to think about what that future setting is that they're planning towards. Because oftentimes in the past, our baseline environmental setting for general plan was assumed to be the same environmental setting you'd be planning towards in the future. Well, now that's a little bit different case with the understanding of how climate change is affecting our communities. Certainly the safety element is the home statutorily for this discussion, but it definitely does not preclude in conversations in other chapters. We actually encourage it, creates alignment across all the chapters. And it does encourage cross-linkages and co-benefits with other activities. Some of the specific actions that are required now as a part of this legislation, and this is laid out in statute, is taking a look and basically doing a gap analysis, what you have on the books already. Certainly the legislature, when they passed this legislation, was not interested in penalizing early adopters. So we want to recognize that there are people out there that have done great work to date, and this process itself might be a little bit different from what they went through. But we want folks to understand, doing that gap analysis, making sure they understand where the gaps are in their current policy framework and analysis framework. Assessing the community vulnerability, this is one point where it's really a data-heavy requirement, and the legislation actually lays out the data that you should use to inform the vulnerability assessment, in addition to using just CalAdapt, which is a good requirement. It's very consistent with what's required by the Office of Emergency Services in a local hazard mitigation plan process, and that's not on accident. Creating a set of goals, policies, and objectives. Again, trying to align this with what's happening in the local hazard mitigation plan, creating a set of feasible implementation measures, and of course, this is a favorite word of the legislature. The word feasible is not the favorite word of most planners, but we try to provide some guidance on what that means. And then implementing the measures and aligning with other plans. This is a really important piece because we again don't want to see these standalone one-off plans that deal with adaptation. We want to make sure they're integrated and working with other plans and programs. So this is just a screenshot of the Cal-Adapt tool, caladapt.org. It's a great resource. It's basically the state's visualization We're currently in the process of going through the 4th climate assessment. We've been doing climate research since 1988 in California, which is the same year the International Panel on Climate Change was established. So we have a long track record of doing climate science research that's focused on California. And we wanted to make sure we had a place to present that information to the public. Ultimately, this has become a decision support tool and a vulnerability assessment tool. The 2.0 version of this just launched a couple of months ago. It's really much improved. If you haven't been back there in a couple of months, take a look at it. It's a great resource. The adaptation planning guide was done in 2012 before adaptation was mandated, but it was really local government focused, setting a 9-step process for how to go through the vulnerability and adaptation process, exposure, sensitivity, looking at the impacts, your capacity to adapt, risk, community risk, prioritizing your adaptive needs, identifying strategies, evaluating and prioritizing those strategies, and then actually implementing them. Again, that last one I think is the important one, and sometimes it gets forgotten. Once you're done with the plan, your job's not over. It's the implementation part that matters most. And the next one is environmental justice. So this is a brand new element, and I'm going to let Zahar go through most of this, but this is a really critical element to pretty much everything that the general plan is trying to accomplish. And SB 1000, which required the element or integration throughout the general plan guidelines, really tries to highlight the cross-sectoral nature of environmental justice and equity concerns. And this is a kind of a first step at integrating this statute into the general plan guidelines. There's a really active engagement process that's going to be moving forward over the next 6 months or so to better define a lot of what's in here. I'll let Zahar go into that a little bit. But the outcomes of this, hopefully by the end of 2018, are going to be a much more significant narrative on how we move forward.
Yeah, our colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Baca, is sort of leading the environmental justice SB 1000 work and working with a lot of communities around the state to sort of figure out some of the questions that have come up around this. What you see on the screen here, other than the section in orange, is directly from the statute, and this is the whole statute. So the SB 1000 requires communities with an identified disadvantaged community, which I'll show you the definitions of in a minute, to identify objectives and policies to reduce unique or compounded health risks by means that include but are not limited to reducing pollution exposure, including air quality, promoting public facilities, food access, safe and sanitary homes, physical activities, civil engagement in the public decision-making process. Note the word civil, not civic. Hopefully we want both. And to prioritize improvements and programs that address the needs of disadvantaged communities. Now, this is really exciting. There's a lot of terms in there that are not defined. So there's been a lot of questions around what does that mean? What does that mean for my community? What if we have a small group of disadvantaged people? And do we have to do the whole thing again? What if we're doing one amendment to our update? So those are some of the questions we're trying to work through. We're working with communities currently, but if there's other questions that come up, we really want you to send them to us. We really want to work with communities to sort of figure this out. So again, it's any city or county that has any disadvantaged community to create either a new environmental justice element or incorporate the goals, policies, and objectives into other elements of their general plan. And it has to happen upon adoption or revision of 2 or more elements after January of 2018. So the statute for general plan updates overall says that they must be updated periodically. There's no definition of what that means. However, the housing element, as we mentioned, does need to be updated on a schedule of 4, 5, or 8 years. And as of SB 379, every time the housing element is updated, the safety element must now be updated. Therefore, you have 2 elements, which now triggers an environmental justice update. So we're thinking that a lot of communities will have to be addressing this in the next few years. Now, the definition of a disadvantaged community, according to SB 1000, for those who do any work in equity or environmental justice, you know there's a lot of different definitions kind of combating each other out there. So SB 1000 has looked at quite a few of them. It means any area identified essentially by CalEnviroscreen as being disadvantaged, or low-income area, which is household incomes at or below 80% of the statewide median, or at or below the threshold designated by HCD. So there's 3 different options for what qualifies as a disadvantaged community.
And obviously, we've had a number of conversations up here about EnviroScreen and its applicability to Sierra. So some of these other metrics might be more applicable to determine whether your community would be required to incorporate this section.
Number C alone would incorporate about 80% of the entire Sierra Nevada. So there are only a few places where we're not below 80%.
Would trigger the environmental justice for the city or county overall. Yeah. Next slide, please. So this is just going through the statute again, which I think we already had on there. We'll just go to the next slide. So again, there are a lot of questions around SB 1000. We are working through them. Please do send us any additional questions you have, or if you're working on an update, we'd love to be a part of that and hear about that as well. So the air quality section traditionally has been really reserved for the San Joaquin Valley, who's mandated to address air quality by statute. However, one of the things we heard, even before SB 1000, as we were traveling around the first time we did this roadshow with our draft guidelines, from communities all across the state, was that they want to address air quality. Even though they don't have to, they're really interested in it for obvious reasons, and want more guidance on how to address it. And so we began incorporating more air quality for other communities into these guidelines, and then SB 1000 passed, which now requires air quality to be considered for any community that, or any city or county that has a disadvantaged community in its boundaries. So it got a little bit confusing because of what is statutorily required and what is not, so we decided to sort of break it down into 2 different sections, recognizing that what is required in San Joaquin Valley may be useful to other communities as well, and we want to highlight that, but really pointing out what they have to do, what is required for that by statute. And so we've done that, sort of a required for San Joaquin Valley, other communities, a new focus on air quality issues in disadvantaged communities as per SB 1000. And then for a number of years now, we've been working with the Air Resources Board on really thinking through the trade-offs around urban infill and high volume roadways. And so we have come up with a new method on considerations and mitigation strategies for air quality concerns around high volume roadways. I have quite a few slides that we've stolen from ARB, borrowed from ARB, that I'll go through fairly quickly. I think we have all of them here. We don't need all of them.
Well, there's a hard copies in the back corner over here of the guidance that Air Resources Board pulled together, and it's also located on their website, but it's linked through the general plan guidelines as well. And just a quick note on the overall discussion, obviously wood smoke, wildfire smoke has been a big issue here. It's affected the economy of the region. Certainly other parts of the state have weighed in on this over the past year and a half. So we have been approached a number of times over the past year about providing additional guidance on how to address wildfire smoke and air quality issues related to smoke. Obviously, the air districts have a primary role in doing that, but we're taking a look and seeing if there's something else that we can do to help provide them some guidance for general plans.
Maggie Witt, if you want to talk directly to someone about this, that would be the person to contact.
Her contact information is at the end of this little mini slide deck here.
So the guides, which we have paper copies of in the back, are put together with ARB and other agencies to provide stakeholders with options and strategies that can be site-specific or project-specific on mitigation for air quality issues. The 2005 Land Use Handbook that the Air Resources Board put out is often misquoted as having a 500-foot rule for building near high-volume roadways. That was one suggestion. It's not a rule by any means. And the goal in this has been to sort of look at the different factors and the different trade-offs around where we build and how that affects different communities. This is an example. So there's a very thorough scientific literature review that happened in order to put this book together. We have pulled into the general plan guidelines just a small portion of that, which is in a table format, broken down into different strategies. So this is just an example of some of those strategies in terms of what you're trying to address, and then different methods of addressing it. There's more columns that aren't on here that show sort of some of the other things to consider, some of the potential pitfalls of that strategy. The intended audience for this is everyone invested in planning, really, including the community, public health officials, air quality officials, policymakers, and it can be used both in planning and also within specific site and project considerations. Bless you. So it is intended as a supplement and an update to the Land Use Handbook of 2005, and it identifies ways for reducing exposure in both existing areas. So there are some methods looking at buildings and looking at existing development, and also in future planned areas for development. I'm just going to go ahead and skip these because this is, I think, a little more detail than we need. This was originally put together for the ADA conference. But here are some additional resources on the different things that went into this document, and some more information on mitigation strategies and things like filtration.
Yeah, for the contact information, right now we have a general PowerPoint up on the OPR website. I think we'll replace it with this one, which has some more specific contact information. So if you don't have time to write this down in the next 5 seconds, we'll get this posted to the OPR website, and I think Sierra Camp has volunteered to send it out as a PDF as well.
Okay. You want to do equitable and resilient communities?
Sure. Okay. So we're transitioning over to some more of the chapters that were developed in response to communities' requests for information. So these are not required by statute, but they do, I think, respond to a lot of the comments that we heard from communities that were trying to go through the general plan process that don't directly apply to statute, but there's still issues that they're struggling with because their communities are interested in it, or they're maybe indirectly related to statute. So equitable and resilient communities, this chapter was started before SB 1000 passed that requires environmental justice. So this was one of the primary homes for that. A lot of that content got moved over to the environmental justice element discussion because it is now required. But what a lot of what's left is sort of that softer community feel, community engagement. How do you work with your communities to better identify how to make it more resilient over time? So provides definitions of social equity. They're different in a lot of different places in statute, so it tries to provide some guidance on how social equity is defined. Incorporating social equity, which is different from environmental justice or equity in and of itself. Social equity is more how do we work as a community to solve these issues. Significant focus on data mapping and examples. And then also resilience screening. This is one place where climate change is talked about, thinking about how do we make a more resilient community, not just from the statutory safety element perspective, but resilient as a softer approach to community, holistic. I'm having a little tough time struggling with the word to use, but it's really a holistic approach to how to build a community that's more resilient and equitable.
I think one of the things that we talked about in here as a way of explaining it to folks is really, if something does happen in a community, whether it's climate change impacts or economic impacts, how do we ensure that the whole community is able to recover equally and together? And so really thinking of that as the resilience screen that we're putting out for communities.
Yeah, so the definitions, some of the definitions that are laid out here, I won't read them all, but National Academy of Public Administration, the American Planning Association definition, which I think is one of the ones that we typically see in general plans in California. The California Planning Roundtable has really tried to grapple with, what it means for California specifically. And I'll just read that real quick. Ensuring that all groups enjoy the benefits of a healthy and prosperous community with access to housing, transportation, jobs, and commerce, and it enables a variety of businesses to flourish.
And I think one thing to note here, as Michael mentioned, this started before SB 1000 was passed, and originally this was the Social Equity and Environmental Justice chapter. It was Social Equity, Environmental Justice, and Community Resilience, actually. And part of that is because there's been a shift in what we mean when we talk about environmental justice over the years. Originally and traditionally, in a lot of formats still, for example, in the federal government, it is still basically the idea of not doing harm, right? So making sure that what we do doesn't hurt certain populations. And we're moving more towards a more inclusive definition of environmental justice, which is making sure that we're benefiting all communities, which is a lot of where social equity fits in. So SB 1000 took parts of both of those, but there's still some parts of it that what we call social equity that aren't necessarily in the EJ statute yet. So we wanted to make sure to capture all of it because we recognize it's really important to various communities. So the Healthy Communities chapter, again, written by our in-house medical expert, Dr. Elizabeth Baca, who did quite a bit of outreach in order to put this chapter together. A lot of what was in the draft, how many of you guys saw the original draft of this document about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago? Okay, so a lot of what was in the Healthy Communities draft, especially around access to nutritional food options and built environment, was pulled out and put into the environmental justice discussion because now that is required for EJ communities. So you might see a little bit of a shift there and be like, why is this missing? But it's still there, it's just moved up into required elements now. But there's a lot that wasn't captured, as I mentioned, by the EJ discussion. And so there's a lot of everything that we do around planning and around built environment affects public health in some way. And so we really wanted to make sure to capture that. And I think in California especially, a lot of communities are really focusing on health and how their planning and their decision-making and their policies affect the health of their community. So we had a lot to pull from. We had a lot of great examples and a lot of things that are happening. There's a lot of great research. And there's a lot of really important relationships between health and things like economics, climate change, human services, and social connection and safety. And so this is quite a robust chapter. If you'd go to the next slide, please. There's a lot of data in this chapter because there's a lot of resources available. And so what we've done is we've really linked to a lot of different places that have a lot of different tools, such as how to do a community health needs assessment if you choose to do so. As well as some examples of different communities and what they're doing around public health.
And where there's specific data layers that apply to statutory mandates, we folded those into the General Plan Guidelines data tool. It's a pretty short section right now. We're going to continue building that out. So over the next 6 months or so, you'll see additional data in the General Plan data tool as well.
I think we had something like 500 data points for the health section.
Yeah,
so really
we're
sort of
those down to 5.
So it's been a process.
Yeah, one of the hard parts with the data is that there is so much data out there, and communities really struggle with how to limit the amount of data to use in a planning process. And what folks have asked us to do is, hey, provide us a curated data set so that we can say that this is the authoritative data set that OPR recommends. We're not going to be able to get all the way there, but we'll at least be able to do a component of that curated data set.
So the next guidance chapter is economic development. This is a brand new section. It is quite short at this point. We worked with the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, as well as some external stakeholders on pulling this together and really thinking about how planning and built environment affects economic development in a community and how that relates to business, employment, displacement, and healthy communities and climate change. This, as I mentioned, is a relatively short section right now. We're looking to sort of beef this up with better examples. There's quite a few examples in here of sort of innovative partnerships that communities have done, but we'd like to build on that, add case studies. We've already had a couple communities come to us and say they want to do an economic development section, so we're going to be working with them and sort of learning from them to update this section as well.
Yeah, climate change is a new chapter as well. Statutorily, climate change isn't required in the general plan, but effectively what's happened since the California Environmental Quality Act has required CEQA address climate change since 2009, greenhouse gas emissions specifically. Really, any general plan that's been done since 2009 has incorporated climate change. Many already did prior to that. There's a lot of different ways to do it: climate action plans, adaptation plans, climate change elements, energy and climate change chapters, and we've seen a lot of different ways to do it. And again, just like with the adaptation piece, we didn't want to penalize those early adopters. We wanted to provide additional guidance to help support updates to those plans and programs, and then try to figure out how do we empower those communities that have not done this analysis yet to do a better job. So we've provided step-by-step guidance on the emissions inventory process and the greenhouse gas emissions analysis process. There's been a number of parallel efforts as we've been developing this over the past 6 or 7 years with the Air Resources Board to support the creation of resources as well. So you'll see some companion documentation on the coolcalifornia.org website, which is managed by the Air Resources Board. And something to pay attention to in the next few weeks, we'll have a release of the Air Resources Board CAT map process. So it's the Climate Action Plan map. They've taken all the climate action plans in the state of California and put them all in a GIS map, pulled all the policies from those greenhouse gas emissions reduction plans and climate action plans and put them up on a website so that geospatially you can know where these communities are, what policies they're implementing, and hopefully that's going to be a really nice resource as people move forward on this. Next. The section is really focused on accommodating the CEQA guidelines requirements, which is 15183.5b, which is the section for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That allows you to do a variety of things like climate action plans, general plans to do this kind of mitigation work, and it sets, a 6-step process forward. And so this is where each of these points, this is straight from the statute, so each of these points has a page and a half, 2 pages of narrative to help support your work in doing this. And we've worked closely with the State Energy Efficiency Collaborative, which is a coalition of partners funded by the Public Utilities Commission to support energy and climate change analysis, to do the ClearPath suite of software tools that do greenhouse gas emissions analysis. So this is one of the primary ways we're recommending folks do this. Obviously, proprietary tools, consultant tools, that's fine as well, as long as they're following the guidelines, the CEQA guidelines. And we would love people to use our guidance as well. I think it's something that really helps provide clarity in this section. I think one of the more important pieces of the implementation of not just greenhouse gas emissions, but also adaptation, is that the implementation piece is really critical. You can't just keep this information in a CAP or a general plan. You actually have to fold it into everything else that you're doing. This doesn't obviously just affect climate change, it affects everything else in a general plan. So thinking about your local coastal plans, your local hazard mitigation plans, your capital improvement plans, administrative processes, staff report templates, how to work with your regional folks to help implement your policies. These are all different ways that we're seeing implementation happen. And really making sure you have the capacity in-house to move forward and implement the policies you're adopting.
So the last 2 chapters are on implementation of the general plan, which, as Michael mentioned, is pretty essential to actually making the plan work, and the CEQA process. The implementation section has updated sections on zoning codes, a little more on form-based codes, other implementation tools. It has a new section on financing tools for infrastructure, which reminds me I should mention that early in the document we also talk about some ways that people are financing the general plans themselves, because that's something we were asked to do. I will preface that by saying we don't have a ton of new information. We know they're expensive and there isn't a ton of money out there for planning, but we tried to link to some resources that we do have, as well as some different ways that communities are going about the financing of their plans.
In the Coastal Commission, we work closely with them. Not that that applies to you guys yet. We'll see how climate change goes. In the Coastal Act discussion, and really try to build some a pathway to understanding how local coastal programs and general plans relate to each other. And then providing additional guidance on the CEQA process for general plans. We did a wholesale review of all the case law that's out there. So if you want the most current set of case law that's available that applies to general plans, it's in this document. We're really excited about this section because oftentimes communities are asked to go to their contracted attorneys to pay for this type of analysis, and our legal staff were able to do it and incorporate this. This is one section I fully expect to be updated regularly. And we'll just a point on that too is we are planning on regular updates to this, probably every 2 years, because there is such a fast-changing world right now on the policy front and legislative front. But we also want to make sure that it's updated to be as helpful as possible, incorporating case studies and links to resources. We're going to do live link checks every few months to make sure that links don't go stagnant or there are no dead links. So we'll be updating this really regularly. It's a big shift from where we were a couple years ago.
Yeah. You have a question back there?
Yeah, just a little connection to the capital improvement program, because that may be a roundabout way of funding, right? And secondly, sort of like catalyst projects and demonstration projects, things like that.
Yeah, I think we talk a little bit about the capital improvement program actually in the circulation section, and mostly thinking about how by law things that we plan have to be implementable in some way for circulation specifically. So there's a little bit of a discussion in there, but I would love more feedback on if you think that discussion could be expanded or more in the implementation section.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Don't forget about the government code section, which requires capital improvement plans to be reviewed for general plan consistency. Often forgotten about, writing down.
Yeah, so that, again, I think the consistency piece, I didn't hone it in so much here, but that was one of the things we heard across the board from every agency and every county that we went to. And so that is something we repeatedly bring up throughout each section, because that is where people have run into a lot of trouble. And it's exactly what you said. It's because people forget about it, they don't think about it. When they do an update or an amendment, they forget to make sure it's consistent and then later run into trouble. So we're trying to preempt that by just reminding constantly why it's important. So here's just some examples of the different data tables that you'll find throughout the document. I think this one comes from the health section. So it has two parts. One is the intent of the analysis. That's sort of like, what are you thinking about? What is the thing that you care about and you want to figure out? And the recommended data to look at. Where it's available, that data will be linked directly to a source. Right now, we don't have a ton of data linked to sources, but we're working to improve that as we go through. As we mentioned, sort of going through data and making sure that it fits all the requirements of the state being behind it is a little bit tricky, so that's been a process for us. Next one. And then this is an example of the policy, of the sample policies that are in each section. Now, these are very small. In each section, you'll find a small table that sort of just pulls out some sample policies. This has actually changed since the screenshot was captured. They are in template form now. They say, city or county wants to do this. The example of where we got it from is listed here, almost always linked directly to the general plan. And then the relationship it has to, or other elements it relates to. So if this was in the housing section, you would note that it could also be circulation or land use, etc. In the end of the document, Appendix A is a much more robust version of this. It has all of the different sample policies we've pulled, broken down by section and theme, so that you can sort of go straight to where you want to go when looking at different policies to consider.
Yeah, and just a quick note on the policy recommendations. If you go in there, you'll see a suite of recommendations on greenhouse gas emissions. So we worked closely with their resources board during the scoping plan update process to align those policy recommendations. So you'll see the local appendix section of the scoping plan has the same recommendations as the recommendations in the general plan guidelines. Hopefully that stays the same. We'll see moving forward. But that's an example of one place where we've been working with other state agencies to make sure there is alignment, so that when state agencies, you want to engage with them on your local planning process, they actually know what you're talking about because they worked with us to develop the policy recommendations.
So our next steps. The first one, after we do more of these workshops, I think this is our first Northern California one, actually. We've done quite a few in LA and San Diego and Riverside. First one we've done up north. Questions, sort of figuring out the places that people need more guidance and more information. And that will feed into our first cleanup. That'll be a little bit of an update and a little bit of sort of going back through. We went through every single person in our office, including all of our interns and us extensively to copy edit this document, and we've obviously missed some typos and some mistakes.
You've already seen
them. We've already seen them. So, so we knew that was going to happen. We're hoping to clean that up in the first sort of semi-update. There will be a couple of other things that will be fixed in there and sort of some case studies added in based on discussions that we're having and different outreach we're doing. And then in the longer term, our first big update, which we're hoping to be in 1 to 2 years, we'll have a new section on water and land use. This was something we actually started to do in the previous version, and we worked with the Department of Water Resources to incorporate considerations around water and land use throughout the document, but then realized that people really want a whole other section. They really want a lot more information on water, and that is a longer process. We need to get a lot more stakeholders and experts at the table to think about this. So that's part of the next update that we'll be doing. Based on the work we're doing with communities, we'll have more information and updated guidance and hopefully some case studies around SB 1000 and how that's working in communities around the state. More updates to the greenhouse gas emissions and adaptation sections, additional implementation discussions on the Delta, which Michael is leading, and then guidance updates on the specific plans. Our last update to the specific plan guidance was 96. So doing this, we realized that was a bit out of date.
Yeah, a lot of people use specific plans in some of the more urban areas. For example, when we were down in LA, yeah, I mean, it's an extension of their general plan, or actually a component of their general plan. Whereas in many Northern California cities use specific plans very differently, more as an implementation. But the fact that it was 96 seems a little bit out of date.
Yeah.
And then zero net energy is also one thing that we're going to be adding in. As you know, 2020 and 2030 zero net energy goals for residential by 2020 and commercial by 2030 for all new residences. There's also an existing building stock goal as well, which we're trying to address. And we've had a number of questions come in on that. The case study piece, Civic Spark, the Civic Spark AmeriCorps program has actually been really helpful with that. Nikki's case study actually is going to be going up on our website here shortly. But OPR is building a case study website mainly focused on the Civic Spark members' work around the state. So we're really excited about that. Many of them overlap or relate to the general plan guidelines. And then we have a lot more work to keep doing with our state agency partners.
Yeah, I would say there's just emerging issues. I think we've talked about some of them throughout the slide deck, but things like autonomous vehicle policies, things like updating our things like, you know, where I live in the city of Oakland, they've just passed a zero parking requirement for any area near transit. And so we sort of just have to see how that all plays out and what we can point to as barriers, as issues, and what we can point to as successes and possibly models. And hopefully we'll have some of that in the next 6 to 8 months and more of it as we continue to do our regular updates.
So at this point, I think the next slide is, so this is our contact information. Sahar, Elizabeth, Baca, and myself are all available. We love to engage with anybody who's interested on this stuff. And I think we have some time to just have a conversation. Unfortunately, with so many people on the phone, we're not going to be able to open the phone line to questions. But if you could enter your question into the chat box in the webinar screen, that would be really helpful so that we can get an idea of what you guys are thinking about. Maybe we'll start with the room and let folks have a little bit of time to put questions into the chat box. What do you guys think? Exhausted?
Yeah.
Have you?
That's how we feel too. That was a good sense of it.
So who's looked at this version of the general plan guidelines? Okay, so for those folks that have looked at it, are there things that stick out to you that are either missing or that are helpful or opportunities for us to engage further?
One thing I'll just throw out as well is that we have been approached by quite a few communities that are doing updates, whether it's a comprehensive update or an update to a certain section, that just want our help in some way. And we're really happy to engage in that process because it helps us learn for the next update as well. So if you're doing an update or a change to a specific section, we would love to be engaged in that process if it makes sense for you, if it adds value at all.
And we know of about 40 updates that are happening right now, and we're engaged directly in about 15 of them. And I imagine from an ad hoc standpoint, we're always available to answer questions and engage, or show up, talk with city councils as well. We're happy to do that, or work with the planning directors or individual council members or board of supervisors members that are interested in learning more about this. You had a question?
I like the fact that you've got the tables, you can pull sample language out. Somebody needs to build an app that auto-generates that. But the whole idea of cost and how municipalities fund these things has always been a challenge. And I'm struggling with different clients who focus really heavily on the implementation element of the plan and those types of projects, and use some of that funding, because there's more funding around specific shovel-ready projects than there is, in the visioning exercise of the general plan. And so I'm looking for like a really close connection between implementation and the vision. How do we do that?
Yeah.
Yeah, the comment was about funding the general plan and the process and how to better link visioning with implementation. And I think we certainly recognize that. We heard that over and over again through the workshops. I think part of what we've tried to do with this document is make it more intuitive to be able to copy and paste from it as needed. As a former recovering consultant myself, I think putting my consultant brain on and thinking how this could be used for informing general plan updates would be helpful. Obviously, every community is unique and there needs to be customization, but at the same time, we wanted to make it as easy as possible to take OPR suggestions and thoughts around specific topics and turn them into local policy if that's something that folks wanted to do.
And I think we've also, one of the things we try to encourage is to build the funding for the visioning and the community engagement into the contract process. So if you are working with consultants or you're setting on a budget or how to do an update, just really think about that at the outset. And then in the financing piece, which as I mentioned is quite small, we did talk about how there's funding available for specific parts, right? So when we think about, often when we think about funding for planning, we're looking for planning funding, as opposed to something like maybe there's transportation funding that can help you fund your circulation element and also projects in your circulation. So we tried to point to some of those resources where we knew they were available. It is a challenge. It's a continuing challenge, and we'd love to hear suggestions of other things we can point to. Yeah.
One more. There's a really good article on the Meeting of the Minds blog about why projects fail. And, everyone blames a lot of projects not happening on the last recession, but there's all sorts of other reasons why things have not happened, and municipalities are struggling to get things, in the ground. Do the guidelines look at why projects fail and how, we can lay the foundation better for success? Because that's really what the general plan is.
Yeah, I don't know that we've specifically addressed the issue of why projects fail, no. I think what we've tried to do is lay out our best assumptions based on the information that we've gathered on how to make them successful. Because we're not necessarily going down to the project level, but really thinking about implementation of the overall policies that you want to put into your general plan and how to ensure from the beginning that there is both stakeholder and financing and overall input and buy-in to get them to implementation. So that's sort of where our focus has been, but that's an interesting sort of opposite look at it. So, yeah.
So just two, I'm not sure these are questions or observations, but two observations. One of them is that I am really happy to see the kind of resilience framework working its way into the general plan guidelines. I also know how difficult it's going to be and how often the definition of equity is going to be tested. And it's really difficult to come up with a clear definition because unlike air quality or level of service for previous standards, this is not an empirical measurement, it's a cultural context. And the culture is constantly changing, right? Cultures are even different in different regions of the state. There's a regional cultural context that changes the definition of that term as well. And I think that makes it tricky and difficult for planners to incorporate into the document, But it's a really good thing that it's there. And I think that's a huge
Sonoma, but if you look at the actual evidence from past wildfire and flood events in California, the incidence of kind of mental health problems going up in those communities and the costs associated with them is staggering. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing to begin looking at within the public health sector, how we're defining the mental health impacts of climatic events.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that there was a lot of interest in pulling out mental health specifically, calling out mental health specifically in the public health section. And so that is mentioned specifically throughout the document, and in relation to climate change, which is in the health section as well. But that is really interesting. I think that is something that would need a little more looking into, that we could highlight a bit more, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think
not a lot of data out there.
Yeah.
It's really a really emergent field.
Well, it's really hard to tease out the climate-focused impacts from overall mental health impacts. There's a lot of other reasons communities might have challenges with mental health issues. But
what we are seeing is spikes in incidents that are indicators of mental health problems, like drug and alcohol abuse, suicide, and other things, post-event. Right? So clearly there's some link there that we're struggling with defining.
Yeah, and from your point on equity and the challenges in defining it for each community, I think one of the challenges we had going through the general plan guidelines process is there's the statute and then there's the guidance. You know, we can't expand upon statute. We can provide guidance on how to implement that statute, and we have a lot of flexibility to do that. But we can't be so overly prescriptive that it takes away choices that the statute may not fully have bookends on. You know what I mean? When we're trying to do guidance, we heard from two very different camps and one in the middle. One was, please give us very concrete guidance so that we can go back and do exactly what you would like. And then we had the other camp which said, please don't give us too tight of guidance because we want a lot of flexibility in how we implement the statute. And in fact, we had some communities that said, you know what, all we want is the statute. We want to just use the statute to meet our legal minimum obligations. And theoretically, you can do that. You can just use the statute and meet your legal obligations. But I think the camp that wanted additional guidance certainly won out from the 400 pages plus that we have here. But at the same time,
we pull out the checklist.
Yeah, and we really tried carefully not to be overly prescriptive in those areas where communities really do need to decide for themselves what something needs to be defined as. And it does make it harder, but it's something that we just didn't feel comfortable wading into.
Yeah, and I think in social equity specifically, that's pretty evident in how we sort of pulled as many definitions, accepted definitions of what that means as possible, and then highlighted sort of examples of how it's being used, because it's also that California is vastly diverse, both demographically and geographically, and so there are different needs for different communities, and we really want to be able to respect that and let the decision-making process be driven at the local level. But we want to give as much guidance and tools and resources as possible to help that.
One last observation. When you were putting together kind of the data and the information on disadvantaged communities, do you know if the basis was the national poverty measure statistics or the adjusted California poverty measure?
I'm not aware. I'm sure Elizabeth, Dr. Baca would know.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure.
You mean in the legislation itself in the statute, or in the guidance?
How you applied it for kind of establishing those thresholds for who would have to report under disadvantaged communities?
Yeah, I'm not sure off the top of my head. I think we'd have to look at it.
Yeah, it's developed by Cal EPA and the housing and HCD. So we are just linking to that, but we should look into that.
Good question. So I don't think we have any questions coming in online yet, and we still have a number of people that are signed on to the webinar, I'm assuming. Yes, so if you do have questions, please use the chat box. If you have entered a question and we're not seeing it for some reason, take a look at your chat box on the right side of your screen. There'll be a pop-up there that allows you to enter your questions in there, and and we'll be able to see those. Anything else from in here?
Yeah. I was wondering if now that environmental justice is required in the general plan, about including that as CEQA.
Well, so the CEQA guidelines are very different from the general plan guidelines. General plan guidelines gives us a lot of flexibility to provide guidance. The CEQA guidelines are primarily statute, and there's certain things the legislature has given OPR authority to clarify within the CEQA guidelines. Environmental justice isn't one of those things at this point, so that's not incorporated in this update of the CEQA guidelines revisions. And as we had a bet with the CEQA team on who was going to finish their 7-year process first. So
barely won.
We barely won. This was 4 years ago, where we thought it was going to actually end that year, but so we made it out for the first time. But no, at this point, environmental justice is not one of those requirements as an environmental indicator.
That would require legislative change.
But I do encourage you to take a look at the CEQA guidelines updates, particularly the summary and the Q&A, the frequently asked questions that we have. The CEQA guidelines, this is the first and the most significant update to the CEQA guidelines since it was first passed in the 70s. So I would encourage you to take a look at it. The vehicle miles traveled piece is obviously an important one, but there's a refined, streamlined checklist that's being proposed. There's a number of other changes that result from case law or legislative changes, and they're all packaged up in this one package. So it's something to definitely take a look at, because it does have an impact on general plan process directly and indirectly, and planning processes as a whole.
We're really excited about it. I don't know if you can tell. Any other questions?
Well, I think at this point, maybe, is there a question coming in? I think what we're going to do is end the webinar itself, and maybe we can have a more focused discussion if there's some thoughts. Really appreciate everybody on the webinar calling in. We'll have the PowerPoint posted to the OPR website in the next day or two. Take a look at that. If you want additional information on follow-up, please take a look at the OPR website. Email lists in the upper right-hand corner of the landing page, opr.ca.gov. Click on eList. It gives you a number of different options for what kind of eList to sign up for, and we'll be able to get you the information you need. We'll also be running a webinar in the next couple of weeks with Air Resources Board on some of the resources I mentioned on local climate action planning, and we continue to host workshops collaboratively with other state agencies and external organizations. Probably every couple of weeks we have a workshop that you can engage with. So please do sign up, and we look forward to keeping the conversation going. Feel free to reach out to Sahar, Dr. Bacher, or myself if you have follow-up questions. Thanks.
Thank you.